What kind of God destroys an entire people? That's one of the hardest questions in the Bible. And honestly, people are right to wrestle with it, because if this was really just God picking favorites and wiping out the other side, then the moral objection is serious. But that's not what Scripture says was happening. This question comes up when people read about the Canaanites, the people living in the land that Israel later entered. And for a lot of people, this is where the whole story starts to feel unbearable. They hear that God judged the Canaanites and it sounds cruel, tribal, and impossible to defend. But the Bible doesn't frame it that way. Scripture doesn't present this as random violence, or as God losing his temper, or as Israel being rewarded for being better than everyone else. What the Bible gives instead is slower, darker, and harder to dismiss. It gives a picture of corruption that had been growing for generations and judgment that has been delayed. We have to deal with that first, because everything else in the series builds on it. Before we get into child sacrifice, before we get into necromancy, divination, sorcery, Baal, Molech, or Asherah, we have to deal with the main issue first. Why did God judge the Canaanites at all? The real issue isn't just that judgment came, it's what had taken root before it did. And that changes the whole picture. Because if judgment came out of nowhere, then the objection gets stronger. But if it came after generations of corruption, after warning, after patience, after a people had sunk deeper into rebellion over time, then the story isn't as simple as people often make it. That's where a lot of people go wrong. They assume that if God doesn't act right away, then maybe he doesn't see. Maybe he doesn't care. Maybe evil isn't that serious after all. People mistake silence for approval all the time, but this story says otherwise. Long before Israel stepped into that land, God had already spoken about what was growing there. In Genesis, he tells Abraham, "But in the fourth generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." That one verse matters more than people realize. Not yet complete. That means the corruption was already there, and judgment still hadn't fallen yet. God saw it early. He wasn't discovering it late, and he wasn't reacting in some sudden burst of anger centuries later. He knew what was taking shape in that land, and still, he waited. That's not reckless, that's patience. And people misunderstand patience all the time. We tend to think that if God hasn't acted yet, then maybe he doesn't mind. If he hasn't interrupted a people, a culture, or a nation, maybe their evil can't be that deep. But Canaan shows how wrong that assumption can be. The delay wasn't permission. It was mercy holding the door open a little longer. And time in Scripture is often mercy. At that point, someone might still ask, fine, but was Israel any better? The Bible answers that clearly. No. Israel wasn't given the land because they were morally superior. In Deuteronomy, God warns them, "Do not think in your heart, because of my righteousness, the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. But it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out." That pretty much kills the shallow reading of the story. This was never a neat little story where one good nation replaced one bad one. Israel had its own rebellion, its own fear, its own disobedience, its own stubborn refusal to trust God. The point wasn't that Israel was righteous. The point was that Canaan had become deeply corrupt. And if Israel followed the same path, that same judgment would reach them too. And that's exactly what happened. When God's own people embraced idolatry and corruption, he judged them too. Israel and Judah were eventually driven out of the land for their own rebellion. Being chosen never meant being excused. It shows this was never about ethnicity. God wasn't protecting one race and targeting another. He was judging wickedness. And when his own people embraced the same rebellion, they weren't spared. So what was actually going on in Canaan? The Bible doesn't describe the peoples in that land as merely different. It doesn't say they just had another religion, another culture, or another set of traditions. Scripture uses words like defiled, abomination, and corruption. It describes the land itself as polluted by what the people were doing. That's severe language, but it isn't careless language, because what was happening there wasn't harmless spirituality. It wasn't innocent ritual. It wasn't just a collection of beliefs people happen to hold. The Bible names the kinds of practices tied to these nations, and none of them were harmless. Child sacrifice, divination, sorcery, mediums, spiritism, and sexual corruption tied to false worship. Those aren't vague accusations. That's the picture the text itself gives. And one of the clearest examples is in Deuteronomy. Speaking of these nations, scripture says they burn even their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. That's not symbolic, that's not exaggeration, that's children. Once that enters the picture, the whole conversation changes. We're no longer talking about a people with different customs. We're talking about a society where the most vulnerable could be destroyed, and that destruction can be treated as worship. Something has gone deeply wrong in a culture when it can harm its own children and call that devotion. And this is where Psalm 106 becomes important, because it shows how seriously Scripture treats that evil. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood. Psalm 106 doesn't soften any of it. It says they sacrificed their sons and daughters to demons, shed innocent blood, and polluted the land with that blood. So this wasn't just bad religion, it was worship that had gone rotten at the root. Like poison getting into the water, it reached into family, into children, into life of the land itself. That is what makes this so serious. And modern people should be careful before looking down on the ancient world too quickly. People like evil better when it looks ancient. Then they can shake their heads at it from a distance and pretend humanity has moved on. But when people destroy their children behind legal rights, medical terms, and talk of compassion, they shouldn't pretend they've outgrown ancient evil. They've just learned to cover it with nicer words. Evil doesn't change just because society protects it, or institutions defend it, or the language around it sounds softer. And it wasn't only child sacrifice. The Bible also describes a wider spiritual system tied to these nations. In Deuteronomy 18, God warns Israel not to learn the practices of the peoples in the land, then names things like witchcraft, omens, sorcery, mediums, spiritists, and calling up the dead. This wasn't one isolated horror, it was part of a whole spiritual culture, a whole pattern of life pulling people away from the true God. Not an idol people invent, but the Creator who is real, holy, and alive. That difference is important. He's the Creator who gives life, judges evil, and can be reshaped to fit human desires. The idols of the nations couldn't save anyone. They were empty wells people kept lowering buckets into. They were false objects of trust wrapped in ritual, fear, and spiritual darkness. So when people in the land were drawn into these practices, they weren't just switching religions. They were turning away from the one who is real and walking deeper into worship shaped by lies, fear, bloodshed, and corruption. That is where names like Baal, Molech, and Asherah come in. The names changed from place to place, and so did the rituals, but the direction was the same: away from God, into false worship, fear, and ruin. The judgment of Canaan can be reduced to they believe different things. That's way too soft. The problem was deep moral and spiritual corruption that had become normal in the life of the culture. These things weren't fringe. They were part of the world people lived in. They shaped how people worshipped, how they chased power, how they dealt with the unseen, and how far they were willing to go into the name of devotion. That is why this first episode has to start here. Child sacrifice didn't come out of nowhere. The darker practices in Canaan didn't appear all at once. They grew out of poison ground. When people normalize false worship and reach for power apart from God, darkness doesn't stay in one corner. It spreads. It hardens people. It twists worship and wears down moral boundaries. Before long, the unthinkable starts to feel normal. That is how a culture ends up offering even its children in the fire. Evil didn't arrive all at once. It deepened over time. The farther people moved from the true God, the darker their worship became. So, was God cruel? That's still the question people ask, and the Bible answers it by widening the frame. This judgment didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for generations. It wasn't about tribal favoritism. Israel was later judged for the same rebellion, and this wasn't some harmless difference in religion. The land had become saturated with practices Scripture describes as defiling, destructive, and abominable. So why did God destroy the Canaanites? According to Scripture, not because they were foreigners, and not because Israel was better. It was because their corruption had ripened over time. Their violence had entered worship, and God's patience had been mistaken for silence. That should sober us, because the same God who judged then is still holy now, and the same God who gave time then still gives time now. If God delayed judgment then, maybe his silence now isn't approval. Maybe people are still being given time. God's silence shouldn't make us comfortable. It should humble us and make us ask what people do with mercy while it's still being offered. And that brings us to the next question. If child sacrifice was one of the clearest signs of Canaan's corruption, what was really happening when children were passed to the fire? And why does Scripture speak about it with such horror? That's where episode 2 goes next. This is Illuminance, where we bring the gospel into dark places.